get started, I want to welcome everyone to our gallery talk with Melissa Vogley Woods. Melissa is the featured artist in our current exhibition, 6+1. She's the +1 and a new artist at the gallery. Even though she's new to Hammond Harkins, she's not new to Columbus. She was born and raised in Columbus, Ohio. She went and got her BFA in painting from the Kansas City Art Institute, and then came back to Columbus and got her MFA in printmaking from Ohio State University. And in addition to making a lot of art and teaching, she has also pursued a lot of interests and projects. One project is Rooms to Let, a program she originated that made vacant houses available to artists to use for exhibitions, performances, and for other arts-related events. She also used to make furniture. She also had a gallery here in the Short North. She was also in a band. And recently, she's been looking at wrestling and using the vocabulary of wrestling in her artwork. So considering her approach as an artist is very broad. She's very inquisitive and inclusive, and at the same time, she is very focused and she gets a lot done. When you think about how she works, the new materials and themes of this work, that she's using them is really not surprising. Other recent exhibitions featuring her work include, among others, from her perspective, at the Firehouse Art Center in Longmont, Colorado, Objectified 2018 at Zorn Institute of Contemporary Art in Korea. She was also in the 2017 Greater Columbus Arts Council Visual Arts Award exhibition at the Columbus Museum of Art. She was also juried into Image Ohio 17 at the Fort Page Shot Tower Gallery here in Columbus. And a special note, in 2016, her work documenting a performance of hers that was called Lost was featured at the Wexner Center for the Arts in their video gallery. And coming up in May, she will be traveling to Italy using an Amina Brunel Robinson research grant from the Greater Columbus Arts Council. So Melissa will be discussing her research in Italy, this new body of work. And so without further ado, Melissa Vogley Woods.
Thank you. So I first wanted to say thank you to Marlena and Chet and Laura and Nikki for having me come and talk to everybody here today. And I wanted to tell you all thank you so much for coming out on a Saturday on Gallery Hop when the parking is challenging. And I'm really glad that everyone could come out and listen to me talk about my work. All of the work in the show is from 2018. It's all, except these little tiny paintings are from last year. It's all a new body of work. And I wanted to explain it in a specific way today. I'm going to talk about the elements that are in my work first. And I'm going to talk really briefly about those elements just to kind of like touch on them, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail. So the elements that I use in my work, the visual clues, are the fold. I just call it a folded form. And I will point that out here. That is this sort of folded form. They're here. And this is the same thing. Can you see this kind of like fuzzier form that's going through? Those are originally, it's like the original abstract shape that I began when I first started this body of work. And the folded form for me represented a legacy of hidden narratives that it has to do with a curated history where there's populations of people whose history has been hidden or stored away. And that folded form is really kind of comes directly from the idea of artists' works that have been like purchased at a museum but never get shown in storage, which tend to be women and people of color, people who are not of the canon in art history. And so that is the root of this folded form. It's an image, if you imagine like the foundation of this image would be a folded stacked quilt pile. So along with the folds, I have arches, and those are these forms here. And the arch came into my work because I became interested in a covering of some sort. So already I have the folded forms as representing this legacy or history, broken history, and things being stored and not really addressed. And then I got interested in like, where do I want these forms to live? And I came to the arch form. And the arch form is, for me, directly from a palace in Rome called the Flavian Palace, and it's on the Palatine Hill. Anybody been there? It's basically like ruins, right? Like 100% ruins. The Flavian Palace was built by Domitian, Emperor Domitian, who ruled in like 80, the year 80. And he was a tyrant of a ruler, and he was paranoid, and he made these archways and semi-domes in his palace, the Flavian Palace, in every room so that he could stand in that archway and project his divinity, because he was so paranoid and like just power hungry, and he wanted his power to last forever, you know, because he also made his father and his brother gods after they were dead, and there was no one to make him a god, and so he had this complex, like he just, you know, it has to do, it became really interesting to me because of this like wanting to hold on to power forever. So that is sort of like how I came to the arch. There's also in this body of work the black and white. So you'll see a lot of the black and white in the sculpture, but also in the paintings. The black and white became an element in my body, in this body of work, because I was interested in the idea of scotopic vision, which is what happens when your vision is compromised due to a lack of light. So when you go into a dark woods and almost all of the light's gone, this is the only time that you will see like a true black and white situation. Everything that you're looking directly at blurs out, and your peripheral kicks in. And so I became interested, this phenomenon happened to me when I went camping with my youngest child, and it just really stayed with me as a metaphor, again, for an inability to see directly, that the periphery becomes heightened when the thing that is in the forefront is blurred. So that kind of connected again to my curated history, that I'm always interested, kind of go back to this idea of hidden narratives and people's stories that are lost and erased. And so that black and white binary became how I wanted to begin this whole body of work. So I started these paintings in New York, and all of the paintings were started with black and white. So also in this work I have Scagliola, which is this material. Scagliola is a plaster process that is originated in northern Italy, and it was invented in the 1500s, the late 1500s, and was really implemented in the 16th century, 17th century, into the 18th century, and then kind of started to die out at the end of the 18th century, and almost went into total obscurity at the turn of the into the 1900s, and then only a few people knew how to make it back then. It dwindled and died out. This is the material. I'll talk a little bit more, I'll get into a little bit more detail about that, but I became interested in it because it, to me, felt very much like a painting, like a three-dimensional material that I could use that was like really connected to painting. And traditionally, through all of my bodies of work, I have bounced between sculpture and painting. I also have done performative video work too, but like it's really kind of between the 2D and the 3D that I've always sort of like vacillated between. And then the final form that is brought into these works are the wrestlers, which are evident in the back works here. And I came to those works because when I did go to Rome to research Scagliola, I saw two pieces of artwork. One was called The Rape of the Sabine Women by Giambologna, and then The Rape of Persephone by Bernini. And these are two very similar sculptures that show a woman being just grabbed and sort of not having any control. The man character is like dominating, the woman's trying to escape. I'm sure you've all seen probably some version of this scenario. It's been replicated many times, this kind of same narrative actually in art through all history. And I became interested in that piece because of this idea of seizing and this gesture of the grab. And just as a very just general thing about someone who is more powerful than another will feel like they can just take from the less powerful. Like this is a historic situation of this process. And to me, I just got really interested in this idea of just like grabby fingers and like grabbing, but also the power of grabbing and like the conflict in this. And so those are the different areas that those are the different like elements that I've kind of mulled around in my work. And in general, my work is sort of about this balance and imbalance between one thing and another thing, and typically having to do with power structures, dogmas, individuals, or two different ideas kind of in conflict. Okay, so with those things in mind, I'm going to talk a little bit more in-depthly about each one of those. And so the folded forms, I don't know if anyone has seen my previous work from like 2 years ago. It was really just images of stacked quilts. And then what happened was I became more interested in sort of entering that stacked quilt. So if you imagine that you're seeing a stacked quilt from far away and you're getting like closer to that and you're going into that stack and you're exploring into this kind of like void space, that is what has happened with the folds. They've become an element that is really sort of moving into landscape. So from still life, they've kind of morphed into landscape. But while they morphed into landscape, they also morphed a little bit into figure. So I feel like the fundamentals of that fold reference the figure, landscape, and the still life of the stacked quilts. And while I got into this move to landscape, I was looking at the Hudson River School, as well as a group of artists called Group 7 that were painting up in Canada. And also this group of painters called the Transcendental Painting Group of 1930 that were down in New Mexico. I don't know if anyone's ever seen any of those paintings. They're very landscapey, but also just really made up, and they feel very much like of a space, of a kind of from the void a little bit. Once I moved into this landscape, the arches kind of formed, and they come in and out for me of feeling like architecture, but then also feeling like an echo and a sound in the void. So I do think about space in this work. The arches became a counter to the folds, so a bit of a nemesis in a way. You'll notice that we have these arches painted on the wall. And so I started doing this last year with my paintings. In a way, it's in the structure of a palace with the archway, sort of like a courtyard. And in a way, it's also like a forum. And it kind of gives this sense that you're in a different kind of location. But I also like the idea that it's this form that is like you don't quite see when you're looking at the paintings. So that's the reason why I like to play with the how colorful they are and how much you see them and don't see them. Because they are sort of like a hum. You know when you have an office fan or something's wrong in your office, everyone's nodding, that has some clock or something that makes sounds that you just, when you first get it, you're like, dang, that's annoying, and then it just, you don't hear it anymore. And so I think of these archways that are painted behind the paintings. I mean, if you think of like patriarchy and its systematic, like its system of I don't know what I'm trying to say, but like, self-preservation. Well, that it just hums in the background, and you don't quite notice it sometimes, but that it's always there. And that is the way that I use it on the walls, and how I like to interact with the painting being on the wall and the painting being an object of a painting. It takes the painting out of a normal space of like a painting on the wall. It just sort of makes it a little bit more into the environment of the installation. With the arches, I was kind of influenced a little bit by Sonia Delaney's paintings, as well as the Futurists and Orphism, which is all these painters that I was looking at are all from the same kind of time frame. So it was interesting that I was looking back at some time where there was a lot of turmoil, and that the people the work that I was looking at were all abstract artists, pretty much. And so that's Abstraction is somewhat new to me, and I mean, it's been about 5 years that I've been working abstractly, but I've had to like kind of understand like why I'm working in abstraction now, and what does that have to do with the time that we are in, especially in a time when you are called to kind of feel like you want to say some bigger things. But I'm finding like how to say things within an abstract form. So what you'll see also with the arches that are in the paintings, that they kind of contradict or work with the folds. The arches in the background are these kind of quiet hums, but then the arches, when they become visceral in the sculptures, are a little bit weakened. So they're not as dominant in 3D as they are in the paintings. And what you'll also see is that the folds in the paintings have become more dominant and more solid than the arches. Like this iron is kind of, it's more of a line. These are kind of holding dominance. This arch is, it's just kind of handmade. It just feels a little bodily, a little bit fragile. And then the arches here are kind of meant to be sort of weak in comparison to the Scagliola, which is, of course, like making you think of marble. And in that way, I liked the flip. I liked the soft forms to become the more solid forms as a contrast, a little bit of a manifesting sort of like what I'm thinking about into a physical space. Also, so I want to talk a little bit more about Scagliola. It has a really interesting history, and its use was always really decorative. So there are very few artists who have used it at all in fine art, contemporary art, or conceptually. And so I really it is so gosh darn, it's gorgeous. And how do you work with something so beautiful? It's like, it becomes very difficult to work with something that is so gorgeous and try to figure out why am I using this? I can't just use it because it's beautiful. So, I'm using this material and trying to come to terms. And so what I told you about how this becomes this solidified version of the soft, it's almost like I can try to manifest these histories abstractly on my own with this fake marble. But the fake marble is more authentically made than actual marble, which is then mined and pulled, grabbed out of the earth. So that's kind of where I've come to with the Scagliola. I'm really interested in the fact that it's fake marble, and I'm also interested in the fact that it's malleable. So when it's wet, it's like icing. So who's ever iced a cake? Isn't that that's not easy, right? And then the cake crumbles, I'm horrible at it. That's what it's like when you're working with it. It's icing, it's just colored icing, and you're trying to make it do things, but it's malleable, and it's gonna be like marble, so you're just totally the master of, you feel a little like a God syndrome, or complex, a God complex, I shall make you look like rock. So I like this weakness, it also has a big history. Marble itself has a big history by being used by those in power to reiterate and prop up their power systems, to let you know that they're really important and all their ideas are true. Places such as churches and office buildings. Well, they do have marble. Government buildings, memorials. Set in stone is a phrase for a reason. So it's really about kind of maintaining, let you know this is exactly, nothing's ever going to change with this, it's in marble. And then Scagliola was used the same way. It's in palaces, it's in churches, it's in very wealthy residents. It looks like marble. It kind of operates the same way. However, it's an art piece. And then we look back and notice that art has always been associated with those in power, because pretty much those people with money were the patrons of the arts. And also sort of could dictate a little bit about what was being painted, of course, right? What was being portrayed. Except for, now we have contemporary art, which is different. It's people just make art now. Back in the old days, people didn't just make art like that. It was commissioned, and people in power were paying for those things. Every example of Scagliola that you will ever see was commissioned by someone very, very wealthy, or in the church, who at the time were very, very wealthy. So the wrestlers are over here, and as I said, I saw these sculptures, and I was interested in how can I show this grabbing thing? How can I kind of like get into start to think about what this means to me, and how does that relate to myself? And you know, I'm not a wrestler. How can I go and just use wrestling imagery? You know, you think about all these things when you're starting to bring in something into your work. So something comes in, you're just going to have to like try to figure out why it is. And so the wrestlers became more and more interesting to me as I got these pieces done, because it's like wrestling is this function that goes all the way back to the classics. So also, just side note, a lot of this stuff goes back to the classics, which is, it just happened that way. I was not classic, like obsessed with the Roman culture or time back then, ancient Rome, but we've got the arches, we've got wrestling, Flavian Palace, and the marble. It's just sort of having my way. But wrestling is one, of course, the oldest sports in the Olympics. Like was maybe like the third, I think, the third sport ever in the Olympics. I don't know what the other two were, killing and probably maiming, but then there was wrestling. It has a really interesting history. It was in Egypt. All cultures have wrestled. Who doesn't wrestle? We've all wrestled. But it is a one-to-one conflict. And I think that is one thing that I just kept thinking about this, like one-on-one, like there's a lot of conflict when it's group to group, and they said this and they that, but then if it's a one-on-one, you always see people like that, those things kind of break down when you're actually talking one-to-one. You're not lumping people into stereotypes. A one-to-one is it's a very kind of like clear space. So I got interested in this one-to-one situation, but then also the fact that wrestling is supposed to be, it's supposed to be fair. So that's another thing that I thought was interesting, because I feel like I grapple with like the fact that things aren't fair and that everything's unfair and uneven, and we all navigate this strange realm together on all these different levels of fairness and unfairness, and that the idea of wrestling is that, well, we're just going to put these two people in this ring in an arena, and it's going to be fair, and then this is where fairness is. We can make fairness as humans. We have sports. Those are fair. There's rules. You know, it's a side of like, it's a display of fairness. And I just got really interested in that. So some of this work has the arena, the little ring that is like a circle. And those are in some of the paintings, not these two, but it's certainly in that one. And so the idea of the arena, the site of fairness, the fact that we create this like display of fairness, I was interested in. But I wanted to just sort of talk about the pieces real quick. So these paintings, these two, and that one, all the ones that are kind of basically the same size, all started together in New York, and I rented a studio and I painted in New York City last summer, and they were all black and white to start with. And it was a really challenging place to paint. It took me 1 hour on the bus to get to my studio from one end of Brooklyn to the other end of Brooklyn. Like, I kid you, I mean, you guys probably know this, but it takes a long time. And my kids were with me. And there was some challenges there, but like, I got them halfway painted and then I just stopped. I came back here, I took the Scagliola lesson and learned it. And then I just sort of focused on Scagliola, and then I came back to these paintings and finished them this year. So it was kind of really interesting challenge to remove myself, to get painting started, remove myself from that process, and then kind of come back in after I've done Scagliola. So my color ideas changed. So I don't know if you can see the Scagliola influence, but there's this, you know, this striation that kind of comes in, this stripy color thing. It's in the legs. It becomes, you know, and the way you make Scagliola is you stack color and squish it, and restack it and squish it some more. It's an interesting play between the two. There's a lot of crossover, like these bars in the sculpture as well. So this is the first one that I put wrestling motif in. and it's just these two arms at the top and this bent arm. And it was purely staring at this painting for a really long time, and it just they had to be in there. And I hadn't done any figure work in like 10 years, because I used to be a figure painter. And I was like, I just have to put that in there. And it was a very scary moment. Because, you know, you can like ruin a painting. Every step is you can't go back. Like, it seems in your mind, you think, well, no, you just paint it out. Like, it just doesn't, it's not a thing. It's always forward, no going backward. So I just put them in, and then it worked. I was interested in the broken arm, the parts, that it's not a full figure. And some of these wrestling images are from women's wrestling. Some of them are men wrestlers. Some of them are women and men wrestling. Because if a woman wants to wrestle, they sometimes, and there's no women's team, they then wrestle the men, which is interesting. There's a lot of things in wrestling about gender that are also interesting. And then these right here, and these are my grabby fingers. So that's where it's the grabby fingers coming in. So if you can kind of see, this is a thumb. So they're sort of moving into the scene. It's like I'm going to take that. But these also these are the fingers. These things coming in on the side are these grabbing fingers and hands. This is the most obvious, I feel like. This one's just got literally like the thumb and the four fingers. I like to play with how much it looks like the thing and how much it doesn't. With everything I'm talking about, it's nothing that I expect anyone to get when you look at the work. I have no need for you to get any of this when you see it. This is why I didn't go into illustration. I'm very bad at delivering a message. I get confused, you know. I like it to be a hint. Like, I would like you to just be like, gosh, it's echoey and dark. Yes, I win. You saw it. So, you know, when I give my artist talk, I try to tell you guys everything I've thought about when I'm painting. And it's, I just like to reveal it all. I'll put it all out there. You guys can ask me anything, and I will tell you, like, process-wise, what I'm thinking. Which I just feel like kind of is interesting that it just lets you know that, like, there's a lot of other things in here that you won't see. But together as a body of work, I think it all comes together that way. These are, I mean, this is a little fist in a way. So if you look around it, you'll see this is a little fist, this one. And this is a bigger black and white fist. So in a way, you know, when I made this, I just thought of like the rebellion versus the established, or the weight of this versus this. And is it an internal conflict of the same thing? Is this is holding that? Are they working together? I'm not sure, but it had something to do with like a contrast between this tiny fist and this more like mangled black and white fist of here that it's at the bottom. This is also based on a giant fist. So it doesn't have like the right amount of bumps for fingers or knuckles or anything like that, but it's got the gesture of a fist. And this piece itself was really like the foundation of kind of all of the work in the show, and it was like the first thing I thought of in this installation to build was to have this in the corner. And to me, it's a fist holding onto a very fragile, tiny little arch. So it's almost like if you're hanging on to something that is actually quite weak, and perhaps you could let go of that thing. The arches in the corner here are, to me, kind of this echo of the gesture, of the action that's happening there. I want to talk about these two pieces here, and they work together visually in the installation, although they're individual pieces. And this was the furthest I got to having just a complete wrestler a very obvious wrestler in the work. This was, I'm adding the wrestling imagery as bodies and tension and grabbing. And at this point, I'm like, no, I do want to talk about wrestling too. So the classic moves, the idea of rules, the idea of fair play, the idea of like a location, and then also the idea of gender within wrestling, but as a metaphor for just life. And so these two panels are the same size. They kind of mirror each other. The one on the other side is in color. The one on the other side is in color, but the figures are broken up. So with that, this one, I just really wanted to render it kind of like more classical, historic, in black and white, refined. It's, marble. The one on the other side, however, is much more like a painting. It has all the color, the nuance. However, all the figures are broken up in more like a collage. So with this is my next direction of my body work, will be these inlay pieces. And so I'm really interested in like marble and collage and the body's intention, and kind of talking about basically my same topics, but with this inlay process. And really quickly to go into detail about the inlay. This piece is cast in Scagliola, which is like a plaster. And then each one of the colors, like this leg, is then carved out. And then I mix a different mixture of Scagliola, and then I inlay, and then I put that in. And you do that for each shape. So these are all different processes. And then you sand it down flat, buff it. You have to use all the different grits of sandpaper, 320, 400, 800, all the way up to 1500 for that perfect smooth finish. And then they're all polished with beeswax. So it's just really interesting like how traditional the materials are. And I use raw pigments in there. Thank you.